Well, our speaker today is Henri Ruff. Henri is well known to us. He's an economist, a tutor for local U3A University of the Third Age, and he is a member of Dorset Humanists. And this is his fourth talk for us. His last one, I'm amazed actually to find that it was back in May 2020, and that was about the possible impact of the pandemic on the world economy, whether it was going to be a game changer or what the game changers might be. He did say at the time that he had no idea what the post-COVID economy was going to look like, but maybe we're starting to get a few glimmers of that. Anyway, today he's going to explore with us the idea of the common good. What do we mean by common? What do we mean by good? And what do we mean when we put those two words together? So would you please give Henri a warm welcome in any way that you can. It might be a silent welcome, but Henri, it's very good to see you. So Henri, I will allow you to share your screen and then we'll just hand straight over to you. Henri, you may need to unmute your own audio so that we can hear you.
Help?
That's it, I can hear you now.
Thank you, David. And just before I share screen, what I'd like to do is to thank the Dorset Humanists for inviting me in the first place. And thank you all for joining me this afternoon. So I'm going to share screen now. And hope that you can all see my cover slide.
Yeah, that's fine, Henri.
All fine?
Yeah, that's great.
And in the spirit of the common good, I think I should just get cracking with the session itself.
Okay.
I thought I should explain very briefly, when it comes to the common good, where I'm coming from in all this, because it's been something of interest and also concern for quite a while. And I think at the core of this and where I'm coming from, it's basically, I see the common good as the antidote to life, life as it surrounds us now and has done for quite a while. An antidote, if you like, to a focus on the self, motivation of self-interest in all this. Whether it's in the economy, we see more and more of this self-employment in its different forms and guises. We see the realms of politics dictated, dominated by self-interest, and I've included these two because I don't want to leave you with the impression that self-interest is the preserve of the right wing and the alt-right. There's self-interest in the form of nationalism coming from the left, and a wonderful short book, Why Nationalism by Yael Tamir, an Israeli academic, but a one-time minister in the Labour government there, making the case for nationalism, for self-interest that governs nationalism from the left. But just take a look at all the different various aspects of life that surrounds us, all focused in a way on the self. I understand that in terms of the neuroscience, there are passages, there are parts of the brain geared up to focusing our attention on the self, other parts on the other. I could imagine that if in Mona Lisa's day there was the smartphone, she'd be taking selfies of herself as well. Joan Armatrading in the realm of music back in 1980, as long ago as that, a big hit for her, Me, Myself and I. You may remember that one. Well, last year she produced her latest album, Consequences. She wrote the songs, she sung them, in her own recording studio. She produced the record and she's done the publicity as well. So very much self-oriented. In the realm of psychology, Sigmund Freud, with his contribution to understanding the ego, but also Martin Buber, a contemporary of his, philosopher, in a seminal work, Ich und du, because he's writing in German, translated myself and you, looking at the psychology, considering the psychology of the other and away from the focus on the self. The libertarian view may be epitomized by Robert Nozick in the libertarian tradition, extolling the virtues of individual freedom and autonomy, and even in the realm of mythology with Narcissus. Have to confess that a recent book by Michael Sandel reminded me of my interest in the common good, and in his book The Tyranny of Merit, you'll see that the subtitle is What's Become of the Common Good. And another book by David Goodhart, his latest book in a series, The Head, the Hand and the Heart, looking at human dignity and the individual's sense of dignity in a world that is amplifying the self and diminishing maybe the sense of the common good. So I know David's introduced me just now as an economist, and I know that several of the other presentations have been certainly about the economy. I've tried and tried and tried not to be pigeonholed. David puts me back in the pigeonhole every time. But you can see, I hope, from this slide alone, that I'm casting the net wider in this session when it comes to looking at the common good, not just the economics. And just take a look at several of the very live issues in the headlines being talked about, being considered actively right at the moment. Income and wealth distribution. You might think, well, that's economics again, but of course its home is in the realm of welfare philosophy. In politics, public health, of course, at the moment, public health vis-a-vis the pandemic, and elsewhere apart from public health in the realm of politics, certainly in this country, the whole debate and effort of levelling up. Coming to the economic sphere, and again, can't get away from it, but one of the effects maybe of the pandemic is a realization that growth is all well and good, but maybe it's economic resilience that matters more. And of course, when it comes to the common good, our treatment of natural resources and the environment. And last but by no means least in the wide net that I'm casting, social psychology, and maybe the culture of current culture of me and the selfie, and moving from the me to the we. So that's where I'm coming at the common good. From my perspective, I've got to issue a health warning here. It's just like the health warning you see on a packet of cigarettes. I'm hoping the session isn't going to kill anyone, but I think you need to be aware and alert to some of the dangers here. The first one is that the common good is hugely complex. I'm going to try and simplify some of the main issues, but the danger is always that I'm oversimplifying. And if you feel that I am, please haul me up on it in the sessions on your comments or questions. Secondly, a very important warning to you all, I am biased here. I think that proves that I'm human and not a robot. I also exhibit some very bad habits. And one of the bad habits that I may be exhibiting this afternoon, that's why I want to clear the ground right now, is I quite like to use examples to illustrate some of the points that I'm making. But I'm using examples here only to illustrate, maybe only to clarify the issue. I'm not using examples here to try and prove anything. I readily admit that this session, the focus is very much on the common good in the Western culture. It's not to say that it's not prevalent, in fact, accentuated in Eastern cultures, Eastern philosophy, and so on. It is, but I must confess, I have limited the focus to the Western culture. And then I want to just alert you that I do try very hard to answer any questions you might have. But if you're leaving this session without an answer to your questions, well, actually, I think I've achieved my overarching aim here, because maybe I've whetted your appetite to investigate the subject a little bit more. So I'd be quite happy about that. This afternoon, two pretty straightforward questions to cover the ground that I want to cover on the common good. Firstly, what does it mean? And to try and address that question, I'm going to have a look a bit more closely at what is common and what is good in the common good. The second question I pose for us all this afternoon is there a way forward towards the common good? And here I want to trace a possible path or several paths towards the common good and likely obstacles in that path. Now, I know that were we meeting at Moordown face-to-face, the convention, I know for these kind of sessions, is that we leave Q&A to the very end of the session. But on Zoom, I think it's much more workable if I just pause at intervals, stop share screen, and invite you. Put your digital yellow mitt up like that to ask any questions, or indeed make any comments. So I'll be pausing from time to time. Please put your hand up, digitally speaking, if you do have questions or comments. So a good starting point maybe when we're thinking about the common good is to look at its evolution. Now, I know I'm going to go through this quickly and chronologically, but I'm talking about its evolution rather than a history of the common good, because I want to emphasize that, in fact, it's much more of an evolution of an idea than just a mere history. Alan Bennett's words on history spring to mind in the History Boys: one effing event after another. So I want to focus on the evolution. It starts a long, long time ago, I should say, with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, not just the ancient Greeks. I've highlighted here Aristotle and Cicero, but it's not to say that there aren't a multitude of Greek and Roman philosophers addressing the question of the common good. I think both of them will be turning over in their graves at the way I've tried to summarize it here on the slide. But in the case of Aristotle, the common good, the good life, welfare and well-being, and virtuosity. A virtuous life in terms of behavior, and a virtuosity in terms of motivation and intent. Then Aquinas, addressing the subject of the common good of course, very much with a religious and a divine perspective, seeing the common good as a universal moral order aligned to the goodness of a benevolent God. I'm guessing, since I'm in the company of so many humanists, I shouldn't dwell on Aquinas, though he warrants a good deal more attention than I'm giving him here. And now, as you can see, I've brought out my broad brush and a huge sweep of centuries to cover philosophers, political scientists, and economists who've all addressed the question of the common good in one form or another. There's no way of summarizing all that. What I would say is that the focus moves away, if you like, from the religious and the divine, the supernatural, to the very earthly. Focus on the individual, on the material, and very, very importantly, in my view, on the metrics, how we measure the common good and the morality. Try to encapsulate that all on the slide with the philosophy, politics, and economics, but maybe you need a moment or two to just browse your way through that. As I said before, it's evolution rather than its history. Shall we turn now to modern day, I would say, in recent living memory history? And if we look at some of the key events, all in our own living memory, here they are. It makes, in a way, my job here this afternoon a lot easier, because we've lived through all this, and there's a thread throughout these addressing the issue of the common good. In terms of the financial crisis back in 2008 and its aftermath, very visibly, very tangibly, the common good has not been served, and therefore an opportunity after the crisis in trying to build back a banking system that is far more robust, build back an economy that is better. After all, a banking system, in whatever shape or form it takes, is at the very heart of any economy. Interestingly enough, exactly how the common good is served in building back there's no one way, and there are at least two. In the case of the financial crisis, one, of course, was to just rescue the banks more or less in their present form. The other was to grab this opportunity to realize that actually the banking system has fundamental flaws, and this would be an opportunity to get rid of the fundamental flaws and build back a banking system and an economy on the back of that that is much more resilient. So you see here that the common good doesn't mean there's one answer to how we affect it. George Osborne and that famous strapline of his in introducing the austerity package, we're all in this together. So that key word together suggests that, ooh, this must be all to the common good. Mischievous use of the word together. 2016 and the referendum, and surely the common good is served because what's happened is the will of the people has been respected. Paris Agreement on Climate Change 2016, and the rollout since then, addressing one of the areas of life, whether you look at it from the economic point of view, whether you look at it from any other point of view, one of the spheres of life where the common good is very, very prominent indeed. And nationalism, which we saw in maybe some of its most raw forms shaping up after the US presidential election in 2016. Again, the strapline is making America great again. Common good or self-good? And inescapably, the pandemic and the common good. Where does the common good lie in our response to the pandemic? So we come to question number one that I've posed for this afternoon's session. What is common in the common good? And here, what I'd like us to look at, to think about, to consider, and I'm going to pause at the end of this slide for questions and comments, because I think there's a great deal here in the answer. It's a straightforward question. The answer is far from straightforward. Is to have a look at some of the key features, if you like, some of it facets of the common good, as opposed to trying to define it, which is very, very difficult indeed. One key facet is that the common good, in the common good, what we find are common interests. If you like, what's referred to as the public interest. The public interest, that's in contrast to private interests. And perhaps a quick illustration of that illuminates the point here is not in my backyard. Not in my backyard, perhaps in situations like housing developments or airport runways or wind farms off the coast of Dorset. A second key facet, and I'm not listing these in any order of priority, and nor are they mutually exclusive. Some of them combine, and perhaps all of them combine into form the common good, and that is not so much interests as concerns, if you like, threats. And again, a very, very quick illustration of that is the pandemic, a global concern, a truly global concern here. Interestingly enough, a concern shared privately at the individual level, and a concern, of course, shared publicly, but not necessarily by all. I'm not going to name names, but quite a number of online companies have fared extremely well, thanks to some of the effects of the pandemic, notably the lockdowns. A third aspect in the common thread, responsibilities. And the illustrations I've quickly jotted down here: fair trade, corporate social responsibility, that's companies behaving well instead of behaving badly, or multinational. These are countries getting together in the interest of common goods. Multinational, say, UN sanctions against a particular country or part of the world, trying to influence and change behavior, all in the interests of the common good. A key feature of the common good is normally a common aim or a common goal that is shared by very many, if not all. And here, and we see this pretty well globally, the recovery from the 2008 financial crisis, the recovery has been an aim and a tangible goal for many countries, many governments, whether they're on the right or the left or at the center of the political spectrum. This one, I think, is a particularly interesting, you might say, oh, that's an unusual feature of the common good. It's what I would call resonant reasoning. And the example I cite here is our approach, if you like, our attitudes to climate change and the environment. There are, I should say, there's a great deal of realization, awareness, acceptance that treating the environment in a more sustainable, in a more sympathetic, in a less abusive way is a common good. But our reasons for buying into that might differ quite radically. It could be public health concerns very much in the here and now with pollution, or it could be sustainability of resources for future generations. And even corporates, they might accept and buy into some of the reasoning, because for them, especially those in the oil and carbon-based sectors, it's a matter of survival. So notice how reasoning plays a key feature in the common good, but it has to be the resonant reasoning, the reason that resonates for you as an individual or for you as an institution, you as a government, and so on and so forth. And last, but by no means least, a clue is in the word common, some form of membership, whether it's geographic along national lines or regional lines even, or even as local as a town, along cultural lines, along ethnic lines, along religious lines, and also membership which is unidentifiable. And the only example I could think of that to illustrate it are the post-referendum Remainers, because the point about the Remainers, since it's a secret ballot, we don't know who they are unless they disclose the way they voted. The Remainers, we don't know who they are, and yet they form a certain group, a certain membership, and there's a certain commonality, though their reasons for wanting to vote to remain may differ very, very radically. I use the word Remainers as opposed to Remoaners because we saw after 2016 the Remoaners occasionally from time to time appearing in demonstrations, in column inches in the press, in interviews on TV and so on and so on. But the Remainers themselves, they are anonymous, and yet there's a commonality, and they share an interest in the common good as they define it. Now, I get the sense that one or two of you out there might want to twist my arm and say, okay, this is all well and good, Henry. You've identified some of the common features, not all of them, but maybe the most important ones. But can we please have a definition of the common good? And you're twisting my arm, and it's beginning to hurt. So, okay, here it is. I've adapted this actually from a definition by Professor Etzioni, which appears in the Encyclopedia of Political Thought. I hope you can see it on your screens, but let me read it out. It's very short and quite sweet. Common good, also known as the public interest or public goods, denotes those goods, services, or policies that serve the welfare of all members of a given community, but also no particular group, as well as generations not yet born. So I'm going to stop share screen and an opportunity for you to, well, raise any questions or comments, observations.
That's great. Thank you very much, Henry. So our first Q&A stop. If you would like to ask a question, I think what you need to do is to raise a yellow hand, is to go to the reactions button somewhere on your screen and click the raise hand button, and then we'll get to you, and you will need to unmute yourself. So we've got a couple already. Simon Whipple, I think, was first of all. Simon, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or make a comment?
Yes, I think this is more of a comment than a question. I'm sorry, I'll try and, I can't make my screen come back, but I don't think you need to see me. Yeah, surely by that definition, anything which is only the result of a referendum doesn't fit the common good, because there will be people who don't believe it is in the interest of the whole community. I'm thinking particularly of the Brexit issue. So I don't think that counts for the definition of common good. And sorry if I'm just being a bit picky there, but interesting point, but I think it's inconsistent to say something where we have the dictatorship of the majority is also the common good.
I don't know if you want me to respond to that, or...
Please, yes.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. That's the very point I'm making.
Thank you.
It's inconsistent. And yet it's the will of the people, but it's not the common good.
Daniel has put something in the chat. A lot of people have lost out thanks to Brexit. I myself recently wanted to buy some fabric from an EU company that sadly no longer ships to the UK. So I think a similar kind of point being made there. Everard has put his hand up. Everard, what's your point?
It might be rather similar to the last one, I'm not sure. It's just, as far as I could see from that definition, it can't possibly be correct, because what is good for one person is automatically bad for another person. That being the nature of human beings. You could think of any huge disaster, like invasion, you know, by Martians or whatever, and somebody somewhere among the humans is going to benefit by it. You know, whatever disaster is, somebody. So there cannot be anything that is good for everybody. That's the only point I was thinking of making there. Not very useful, perhaps.
Can I come back on that very quickly, because I think it's extremely useful what you've just said now. And I'm really encouraged that the first two, if you like, comments reinforcing what I believe, that you can't define the common good, but you can look at some of its key features. The other point I would make, which is why I'm saying I think the issues you raise, I'm going to come on in just a moment or two about whether one's own interest and is necessarily no one else's interest, but I want to go into that in a fair bit more detail.
Thanks, Henry. And thank you, Everard. Let's go to Craig next. Craig.
Yeah, hello everyone. Yes, thanks Henry for teasing out the issues as usual. It kind of looks to me that self-determination on a nation-state basis is a key determinant throughout the world, and it's very, very difficult to get into definitions of common interest, because each nation-state will see its interest in different ways depending on how it's organised, its politics, its power groupings, and even within a community there will be a broad spread of different interests and different abilities, different opportunities. But I'm always, not that I'm a great supporter of this person, but he did say the things, Michael Heseltine used to say that the things that unite us are far greater than the things that divide us. So if the issues are big enough, and important enough, then people will get around, hopefully, settling their differences, like international trade, for example, which is you could say we're in an economic war. You know, that's the way the US looks at China now. And very shortly, you know, as your good self, you've been alerting us to the fact that China is making huge inroads with Germany and establishing a bridgehead into Europe. So we've got power blocks and economic interest, not call it a war, but in effect, it's about resources and how people prosper from them. So there's a big macroeconomic influence, and I think the definitions come out of the wash. So that's my Duffins one.
Thank you, Craig. Henry, do you want to respond to that?
I'm very conscious of time.
Yes, okay. Yeah.
So
we'll just
we try and get everyone who's got their hand up a chance.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's go to, well, I'll just say that Aaron's put an interesting comment in the chat about voting habits. Some people vote on the basis of self-interest and other people vote on what they think is the national interest. So there's just an interesting contrast there in our voting habits. But let's go to Paul next. Paul Entwistle.
Thanks. Excuse me. I might have been slightly confused by what Everard was saying, but I think he was implying that we have a sort of zero-sum game in society and the economy, and that if one person is better off, then that necessarily implies somebody else is worse off. No, that would be directly contrary to my understanding of the purpose of communal activity. And we can be guided somewhat perhaps by the division between what occurs in the private sector and what we deem best to be in the public sector. But it seems to me if we communally provide a service that the private sector would not of itself bring to the table, then we have added value across society as a whole. And those activities are beneficial, and it's absolutely not a zero-sum game. It's partly why current societies are so rich.
Thank you very much, Paul. Let's go back to Simon again. Simon, do you want to? Oh no, Simon, I think was just putting a thumbs up rather than a hand up, so that's fine. Henry, we don't have any more hands up at the moment. Do you want to resume your slides for now?
I'm happy to do that, yes.
Okay.
Just double check that you can all see the slide that I've just run through.
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. Coming soon. Yeah. So I broke up the base question of, you know, what is the common good into what's common in the common good. Now I want to consider what's good in the common good. And what's good in the common good can be, broadly speaking, categorized into three compartments. The first, if you like, category or compartment will be tangible and intangible benefits. That's what the good comprises. And so let's have a look at some of the key tangible and intangible benefits that arise. The first one is functionality. You know, jolly useful. So it's jolly useful to be driving on the same side of the road. It's a convention, and it's a tangible benefit of everyone buying into the common good. If any of you have experienced the traffic, particularly in New Delhi, but more or less anywhere in India and other parts of the world, you will appreciate just what kind of a benefit it is in countries like our own, where for the most part they drive in the interests of the common good, drive on the same side. The second and still quite tangible benefit will relate to safety or security. And again, probably the broadest illustration of that is in terms of national defense. And interestingly, national defense has a very, very long history, but it looks to have quite a future, as we experience already, and this is maybe going to escalate, the different forms of hybrid war. Less tangible, actually fairly intangible benefit is trustworthiness. Now, I had a bit of difficulty trying to find a quick and ready example of trustworthiness, except when it's conspicuous by its absence. So I'm thinking immediately of police forces. I'm thinking of the judiciary in some countries, not to mention the justice system in some countries. Quite intangible as benefits go is greater cohesion or less conflict. And this again, what springs to mind is the divisiveness that has surfaced, shall we say, perhaps it was always below the surface, but surfaced in the wake of the period post-referendum in this country, at least. So some of the key tangible and intangible benefits that make up the good, but I want to put these into some kind of perspective by highlighting that we need to think about these in comparative terms, comparative benefits, that's to say, in terms of one advantage over what? Well, against alternatives. So if we look at public health, in the public health sphere, the good, is it better served? Is healthcare system better served by nationalized, in this country, NHS system, or private, or what? Because both sectors and both approaches are trying, they are trying to do some good in the Hippocratic sense of the word. Do no harm, but do some good is what Hippocrates did say in the same breath. And to compare the goodness over time, time always plays a role here. And the sphere that springs to my mind is basically in housing. I'm thinking about housing history in the UK, the 1960s. We saw when we combined private and council house new building hit the post-war peak of just over 400,000 units a year. Maybe good in terms of the quantity, maybe less good in terms of the quality. And that's followed by decades which, broadly speaking, started from the 1980s onwards. It ushered in not just one decade, but numerous decades. Maybe we're still in this period where it's an era of the common good, but only for the happy few. The third compartment, if you want to think of goodness in terms of compartments, is basically ethical goodness. So we're talking here about virtuous, good because it's virtuous. Again, we go back, I suppose, to the father in philosophy of this with Aristotle, though Plato was also thinking and writing about this as well. But other other philosophical schools thinking here about ethical considerations where we pay respect. We pay due respect, either respect for the individual's autonomy, which is what libertarians emphasize probably above all else, or we pay respect to the intrinsic, inherent nature of the subject matter. And the example I like so much here is one provided by Michael Sandel in a different book of his called What Money Can't Buy. And it's a simple enough illustration. It's love. And remember the old Beatles song, Can't Buy Me Love? Because what Sandel is saying is love, the intrinsic nature of love itself, you can't buy. And if you are buying love, it ain't love. Another, if you like, shape that goodness can take is doing the right thing. This is very Kantian for those of you who follow the philosophical part in thinking, and an illustration here, doing the right thing for very many people will be considering the sanctity of life. Another form of doing good is what is socially just. And here I am borrowing heavily from the thinking and the work of John Rawls on social justice, where basically he has an approach, he has a possibility of overcoming self-interest, and self-interest has already been mentioned by one or two of you. Maybe it's a zero-sum game, maybe it isn't, because I want to look at this in a moment or two, but socially just, where we decide on policy, we decide on what is, we decide on serving the common good by shelving our own interest here, donning the so-called veil of ignorance, construct which he introduced here, into what is socially just, what serves the common good. And if you just glance at the slide I'm showing you now, you might say, well, you've got three categories there, but broadly speaking, they might actually collapse into two: material good and moral good. Shall I pause there to take any more questions or comments? I'm going to stop share screen.
Thank you, Henry. Let's just see if anyone has any comments or questions on that section.
Peter.
Yes.
Henry, nicely spoken. What about the Quakers and business, the Quaker business ethics? Is this something that you're familiar with, or you mentioned tangible, intangible? Does it ring any bells with you?
It does indeed, because in a previous life, I used to work in banking. I'm not going to name names here, but there's a bank quite well known to us all of Quaker origin, and until quite recently, historically speaking, with some of the original Quaker families running the bank. So it rings bells.
Yeah, it obviously starts with a big B.
I'm not giving any clues. Have we lost Peter?
I think Peter may have said what he wanted to say, but we've got another hand has gone up. Craig, come back and tell us what you want to say.
Yeah, I just I thought your point, Henry, one we've discussed before about the common good of housing and the post-war period in particular, and the fitness of purpose of housing and social good, the common good being served. But then, as you say, from the 80s onwards, really the big divisions. In fact, the great example of housing not serving the common good, because now it's so unaffordable for so many in a society, and in fact it creates big divisions, huge divisions. In fact, it is perhaps one of the biggest social ills that we've got to contend with. Well, whilst it gives a lot of us some comfort in knowing that our assets are protected, large numbers of people are subjugated to the poor provision of housing, whereas in other countries, rental levels, availability is less polarized. So I think that's a good example of that you've given me, an excellent example, in fact, of the common good not being served. So by looking at things that don't work, we can then define things that should work better and come around the uniting people around the common purpose, because we can see the divisions that are caused when things are askew.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. We've got two more hands have gone up. Jackie first, and then Gary. Jackie, what's your point?
Just going back to your list there, Henry, the one that came up for me was the safety and security one. And obviously you talked about nations. Now that's a classic example of a win-lose situation, isn't it? And war. And if I can actually just extend that argument, I just wonder, I'm sure you're not saying this, but what comes up for me is, are we actually saying that in order to satisfy a common good, we need every country in the world to have things like nuclear weapons?
I better come back on that, hadn't I? Since you raised the question. No, I am not saying that at all. And at least in my own mind, it doesn't follow. If I could just mention, because you mentioned it, wars certainly in the past and maybe even to this day, we identify more or less along national lines. But the way I see the future of war, I'm very much of the opinion that it'll take on a different complexion, what's called hybrid wars, not necessarily waged by nation states, albeit maybe sponsored by particular nations, but the agents of war there could be very, very small segments of different parts of society, including, in a way, hybrid civil war within a country. So I just wanted to mention the national sort of dimension to all this. But I would say that I wouldn't go along with the idea that this somehow justifies or substantiates the race to nuclear.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's go to Gary.
Hey there, thanks. Apologies for oversimplifying, perhaps, but you mentioned Sandel describing love as something that couldn't be bought. Is it possible that it's something that can only be bought? For example, we often have very highfalutin terms to describe love in, but the actuality is it's often the provision of resources that grants it. So, for example, take a mother and offspring. It's the propensity for love there is within the child, but the love becomes a reality when there's a provision of resources in terms of food and things like that. In the same way with romance, it's often gifts between the lovers that then lead to more deeper affections. But nevertheless, it's a resource exchange. But I'm sorry to you're probably you was just summarising there anyway. But
Can I come back on that one?
please.
Yeah, because I certainly can't speak for or on behalf of Michael Sandel,
Yes.
but he addresses the very aspect that you've raised, because if I may say so, well, I'm not going to say you're quite right, but I'm going to say I share your view that in many situations, shall we say personal situations, parent-child, or in romantic situations, what may be happening, not what's actually happening, what may be happening is what psychologists call transactional analysis, where you give a gift, or what I take out of Sandel on this very issue in the parental context is unconditional love. And
Yes.
I'm not a parent myself, so I'm not speaking from personal experience, but I think I can grasp that. And in the romantic sphere, well, I'll leave that one.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. And we have another Gary. Gary, what's your point or question?
Hello. Yes, I'm interested in this idea of the tangible and intangible benefits we've just looked at of the common good. And I would maintain that things like trust, cohesion, and safety and security are under threat in some ways more than ever before, because there is a propensity for people to see self-interest ahead of the common good. Now, I'm interested whether historically this has always been the case, that these intangible benefits have always been gradually under attack, or whether this is just a recent phenomenon. And I was wondering what Henri or other people's views might be, so whether they think that we're in a more insecure situation than we were previously.
I'd be very interested myself in other people's views on that one.
Well, maybe no immediate thought. Oh, Craig has come back. Craig, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, actually, because the security we all have, we define in different ways. But in terms of our national security and our ability to trade, our ability to enjoy the affordability of things that we take for granted, the fact that we've created that NHS, even though it's eroding as we speak, and compared to the French and the Germans in particular, the BBC article today, great analysis, highlights that we have less resilience now in our NHS than we've had for the last 10 years. As events are unfolding, not just the pandemic, but it always runs as a lead machine, and it's been underfunded. And I know that 2008 we had to recover from, and there was never an easy choice here, and it's been recognised. But the whole, I think people, the very good point you make as well, Henri, about the world economy being controlled, and although we're not in hot wars, we're in a lot of positioning cold wars that we are just getting our head around. And the trading blocks and the ability to trade, and the fact we've offshored lots of our manufacturing to China, and a regime that was abhorrent to a lot of people in democratic countries, and still is to a large extent, with the subjugation of large elements in the East. We now have this unholy alliance, and Russia and others trying to come back, but not just Russia. I'm sure we are probably as dirty players as anybody else at cyber economic sanctions that none of us will be told about, because it's something that our security services will be getting an angle ready for whatever comes up. So the fact that we've got this hybrid situation with technology, artificial intelligence now leaping on at a rate of knots that none of us really know, what's going to happen in the next 10, 15 years. So you've got a potent mix of 24/7 news coverage with lots of false news, as we all need to get used to. Well, we are getting used to, but the analysis exposing it as false news and different power blocks. So it's, I think for a lot of people, peace of mind would come from switching off and not listening to the cacophony of the different influences. But of course, for a lot of people, they are unnerved by it all, and it makes them very nervous. My mother-in-law in particular, she's 92 now, but I'm trying to get her not to watch the news. I'm trying to engage her in other things as well. And for a lot of us, I think that, it'd be good to take time out to do other things. Anyway, it's just an observation, really, that the comfort that we've all got in hopefully being masters of that mix of different influences, I think is a great challenge. And politically, of course, it's a huge challenge because of the floating voters and what we've seen in populism in the West in particular, which is still ever present. So anyway, I just thought to give those observations.
Thank you, Craig. Henry, we've got, should we just take two more and then go back to the slides?
Yeah.
Barry and Kathy are waiting, so we'll just go to Barry next. Barry.
Hello, everybody. Just to return to the generality of the common good and the personal good, I would suggest that intrinsic to all people, and possibly all social animals, is an equilibrium or a dynamic between personal benefit and the common good. And I think if you look at the common good carefully, it exists to actually give personal benefit. It's a way of extracting personal benefit from social activity. And I think certain circumstances skew this in various directions. When there's a common threat, like COVID, we find the rise of the common good. That is, people subserving their own personal requirements to the common good, wearing masks, getting jabs, obeying rules, because they can see the benefit in it for themselves. But there are other forces that swing the pendulum further away from the common good towards personal good. And there are many things that you can think of, but I would say the rise of Western liberalism, which I call the cult of I, has done quite a lot to undermine the common good in a very general and very deep way.
Thank you very much, Barry. Let's go to Kathy and then we'll go back to you, Henry. Kathy, what's your point? You just need to, that's it, unmute yourself.
Well, I've been thinking for quite a time about the safety issue, and I didn't actually know I was thinking about the common good, but the countries where we share our affluence more and our education more and our prosperity, I'm thinking slightly of us, but I think we're going slightly the other way at the moment. But some of the Scandinavian countries, we're actually a lot less likely to go to war or have internal wars. And I think that's because we have actually shared our common good, which makes us all safer.
Okay, thank you very much. Henry, should we go back to you now?
Indeed, thank you. I'm so conscious of time and I don't want to rush either, but
okay.
Let's move on. Let's move on. Now to the stage up, the second broad question, how do we get there? How do we get there? And as you can see on the horizon, the common good shining brightly like the sun, and the path that maybe several paths we could take towards the common good, at least in the right direction, heading there. In a way, the common good, it's a notion, it's a concept, and in a way, it needs to be sold. selling the idea of the common good, so that you get greater awareness, you get, if you like, greater acceptance, and then you get greater actual buy-in. And when it comes to selling, what they teach you at sales school, as they taught me, there are just two things you have to do when you're selling something. There's benefit selling. Well, we've already looked at the benefits, whether they're tangible, intangible, comparable, or ethical and moral. So we've looked at the benefit side. And I want to spend just a few minutes on the second bit of selling, objection handling, because when you're trying to sell anything, whether it's a second-hand car or whatever it is, you need to overcome any objections. So let's have a look at the main objections there might be to the common good. And broadly speaking, the first set of objections, if you like, not objections, but obstacles, is self-interest. And a number of you in your comments or questions have already raised this matter of self-interest. I want to distinguish here, I think it's an important distinction between own interest and what could basically be contrasted with self-interest. Own interest, well, if we just take this session, it has been in my own interest to, well, spend time researching the subject, spend time putting together, if you like, this presentation, thinking about the whole thing and how I'm going to present it in a simple but not oversimplified way. That's been in my own interest. But it's not been at your expense in the audience, because you're here, you're listening, if you like, to me, you're asking questions, you're raising comments. So I take it that these are shared own interests and not mutually exclusive, or I'm not pursuing my own interest at your expense or to your detriment. It's when we have selfish interest, that's a major obstacle to pursuing the common good. And if you delve into the literature, what you'll find is a bit of jargon. It's called the tragedy of the commons. And by the way, this isn't a new obstacle at all. It was first written about in England, in fact, in 1833 by William Foster Lloyd, who talked about the tragedy and raised the issue of the tragedy of the commons. And the example there is quite a straightforward one. You've got common land, where individuals, it's a situation where individuals have access to a shared resource, the commons. And they act in their own interests, that's all well and good, but some of them will act in their own selfish interest at the expense of, and maybe to the detriment of, the commons as a whole. So an important obstacle in our path towards the common good. A second major obstacle on the path towards the common good is ideology. I think we all know what ideology means. I like to think of it as, in very, very simple terms, ideology, that's where I know the answer. This is the solution. What was the question you had? Ideological thinking. And where do we find ideology? We find ideology everywhere, but it's maybe in its most conspicuous and transparent forms in libertarian thinking. The freedom of the individual at anyone's expense. Now, I say libertarians, we're talking about quite a spectrum. On One end, we're talking about the thinking and the work of people like Ayn Rand, where society, there's no such thing. Well, Ayn Rand said it first. I know that you probably heard it spoken by someone else more recently in terms of recent political history, but there's the Ayn Rands of this world. They're the Robert Nozicks, a much more moderate libertarian who extols the virtues of the interest, the independence of the individual, but not at all expense, not at any price. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we're not talking about the left wing here, we're just talking about the center and the liberals. And a major obstacle to thinking about pursuing and moving along that path. Well, I've done my job. I've pointed out that if you're going to sell the idea of the common good, you need to extol the benefits and you need to handle the objections. Let's assume, at least for the purposes of this afternoon session, that at least I've identified the main areas of objection and obstacle, because what I'd like to do now is to race on and have a look at the path, notwithstanding the fact, and you'll see them still in the clouds, of ideology and self-interest as being remaining potential obstacles. And what does that path look like? Well, a part of it, a part of the path is paved, if you like, by this notion of sharing. A commonality based on sharing. There's a bit of modern economic jargon here. It's sometimes called collaborative consumption, peer-to-peer lending, crowdfunding, room renting, couch surfing, car sharing, job sharing. Actually, sharing is about as old as the mountains, but it's recently become quite fashionable in certainly in the corridors of economic thinking and economic policy, that sharing is a step we can take towards the common good. If you are interested in learning more about, and this is already in existence, learning about sharing, I can recommend the book by Matowska and Scheinwald called Generation Sharing. They've been right around the world, and there are about 200 illustrations, examples of this generation share that already sharing, already have a well-developed sense of the common good that sharing can offer. There are different forms of sharing. They deal with something like 200 examples, but the other area of sharing that I would just highlight here is sharing responsibility. The whole concern with unfair trade by buying fair trade products and maybe even fair trade services across frontiers, across national boundaries, and in fact, in the case of fair trade, across continents. So sharing may take us 1 or 2 steps of the way, and then overlapping may take us towards the common good. And the examples of overlapping that I would cite here are from the healthcare arena. And I'm thinking about healthcare, okay, in the UK, dominated by the NHS, but with a strong and arguably a growing presence by the private sector. And there is an overlapping of these two approaches to public health and the common good that public health serves. Another step towards the common good, and these, if you like, are different steps. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can combine several of these steps, is the idea of the joint and the mutual. Now, I put up Nationwide Building Society. This is not product placement in my presentation. I'm not being paid, and I'm not even a member of the Nationwide as it happens. But the Nationwide Building Society is one of the few major building societies that have resisted the temptation back in the 80s, 90s, and so of other building societies, other mutuals, of going private, going commercial, becoming a bank. So in the case of mutuals, the depositors, the savers, and the borrowers, if you like, for mortgages in the case of building society, they're both members of the organization, both sharing, if you like, mutually the mutual advantage that that offers. Credit unions, there are some credit unions in this country, but credit unions are associated, I suppose, mainly in the United States. And I like to think about the United States because that's such a market-oriented, if you like, a self-interested, free market-driven economy. And yet there are some 5,000 credit unions in the United States, and they cover just under 50% of economically active population being members of credit unions. They are basically mutuals. And then another way of approaching the common good is by negotiation. And here, at a multinational, multilateral level, we're looking at the Paris Climate Agreement, a negotiated agreement, and just think about how long it took from Kyoto to Paris. And the other one that I think we're all too familiar with, fisheries. That's another example of where the common good can be served if the common good is driving fisheries policy as opposed to self-interest and selfish interest. And last but not least, and in a way, a form that we're all very familiar with, have been probably for a long time, very, very close indeed to the common good. And this isn't fantasizing, this isn't dreaming, this isn't aspiring, it exists. Coercion. And when I think of coercion, well, I think of HMRC. I think of taxation. And just look at it. We're all compelled to pay our taxes. There are penalties for not doing so. There's some penalties for not doing so. But look at the good that's being done thanks to all the revenue collected by HMRC. Think about health. Think about the social welfare budget. Think about education. Think about defense. Think about transport. All in the common good, already achieved. So coercion can work, and it does work. Over to you for more questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Henry. Okay, well, we normally try to wrap up by 3:30, which doesn't give us very much time. I can delay things for a little bit longer, so if people would like to stay and chat. So Barry King, you've got your hand up for a comment or a question. What's your contribution? Barry, if you'll need to just unmute yourself. Okay.
Sorry,
yes, that's it, Barry. You've done it.
Right, thank you. Yeah, thanks once more to Henry for a lovely presentation. And he mentioned the ideology of libertarianism. There are many other ideologies, of course, and the 20th century was rather full of them. But I wanted to ask him what he thought about the idea of there being a kind of continuum between libertarianism at one end and right at the other end, a kind of communitarianism, if you like, but it has in the past possibly been communism. Because it seems to me that with libertarianism, within that, there is the freedom of the individual to do all sorts of creative things, which has given us a huge improvement in our welfare over many years with the growth of capitalism and so forth. And yet at the other side, there is communitarianism, where we do need to look at the health of the public sector. So is it not a balance between the two, and somewhere we must draw the line? And I wonder whether Henry would have a view of where that line would be drawn, if that is a fair question.
Shall I come back on that? I think it's a very unfair question because it's a very tough question, but it doesn't surprise me in the least. And of course, you're absolutely right about the continuum, if you like, the spectrum, and it's littered. That spectrum is littered with many. I've grossly oversimplified that chart and only talked about libertarians. We can talk about political pluralists, talk about liberals, and so on and so forth. What I would say, perhaps this will be a surprise to the uninitiated, but the libertarians are actually quite keen to serve the common good in their own way. But their arguments and their approach is, well, tenuous. It's very, very difficult indeed. And the more extreme, the more difficult it is. But someone like Robert Nozick, who is a libertarian, or he's dead now, but who was a libertarian, quite moderate. And of course, he can field most of the objections to the way individualism and selfish interest does not serve the common good, but turn it into own interest and shared interest, and it does. And I believe that communitarianism is built on foundations such as sharing and overlapping and negotiation, and in fact the paving stones that I tried to lay down in that last slide of mine.
Thank you.
Henry, it sounds as though you have some sympathy with Nozick, but less so with Ayn Rand.
I'm trying to be balanced and objective in this session, and now you pointed out, it's very embarrassing, you pointed out one of my biases.
Well, that's perfectly all right. I shouldn't think we've got too many Ayn Rand fans here, but we may have. But anyway, I'll save your embarrassment, Henry, and we'll go on to Belinda's point or question. Belinda.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thanks for your talk. I was wondering, since the 80s, I guess, we all in society have been pointed and led towards selfish self-interests, to worry about ourselves and I'm all right, Jack, pull up the ladder. I think a lot of people, I guess most of the people here, and certainly a lot of younger people who have become more motivated politically over the last few years, how can we overcome that? How can we redirect the people that have been educated into selfishness back into seeing what we really need as a society to elevate the common good?
Another tough question.
We're expecting you to have the answer, Henry.
That sounds like a separate session. I mean, it's huge. The question you're asking is enormous. But can I just briefly comment that right now in, if you like, 2022, we've never had a better opportunity to raise, if you like, the profile of the concept of the common good. It's partly to do with, okay, the effects of the pandemic, It's partly to do with the realization that the foundation stones on which a so-called free market economy is built are very, very shaky indeed, full of cracks. And it's not a case of just cementing the cracks back in, but a completely different approach to that, an approach that actually provides resilience as opposed to growth. I tried to hint at that in one of the earlier slides. And it's never been a better time because it's visible and tangible that things aren't looking very good, no matter which way you turn, and arguably no matter which country you're in or system you're in.
There's a bit of a note of pessimism coming in there, Henry.
I told you I was biased.
Okay, let's go to Gary Bootle.
Hi there again. Thanks for the second half there. May I ask, regarding Nozick, he's the sort of famous example is the Wilt Chamberlain basketball player who's sort of appears appears to do a match. He charges a fee, and then his money is taken off him by force for doing so in a thought experiment. And Nozick challenges the justification for doing so. Now, I can understand that the something like HMRC could do that in the case of something as important as healthcare or sort of other criminal things. They could justify doing it, but things that the sort of uses of public money at the peripheral end that are involuntary, that it then sort of strikes me as sort of more challenging. For example, we're quite often told that it's immoral that people are reduced to using food banks, but food banks are a voluntary way of giving food to people, but we think it's perfectly legitimate to say, well, let's take the money off the person by force with threat of imprisonment, and that's such a thing, and then redistribute it. But it's like, is that really more moral, and is that for the common good? Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, I can, because you're inviting me to take out one of my favorite hobby horses. It's coming out of the stable now. For those of you not maybe so familiar as Gary with Nozick's work, one of his big things, one of his big beefs is tax. And he refers to taxation as state organized theft. And if you look at it that way, but the thing that he then says is you can still collect that money, that revenue, you can still, if you like, fund whatever it is you regard as morally valuable and virtuous by basically incentivizing people. So let me come to my hobby horse, hypothecated taxes, where the amount of tax you pay is determined, right? But how it's spent, you choose. Maybe not 100%. You don't choose 100% because lots of people will not pay a penny towards certain areas of the economy and the society because they think, there should be a law against it. But what he's doing is, and in very cleverly, of course, because he was a brilliant philosopher, he is basically turning it and being creative by saying you can achieve the same ends in a non-coercive way, if you like, in a menu approach. He talks about the menu approach. You choose, and that gives you you get the psychological satisfaction of actually feeling as though you're in control. So yeah.
Okay.
That's an awesome answer, thank you. I'll look up that tax that you mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary. Let's go to Paul Entwistle.
Points. One quick one on Nozick. I don't know if he has any idea of the propensity of the rich to share their wealth in the UK, but it is staggeringly low. If anybody would care to look that up, you will find that although we have some very generous rich benefactors, and I could name a few names, you probably can too, overall, the rich are extremely tight compared to the rest of the population, at least so far as the stats go. The other point I wanted to make, by virtue of time, it has to be rather glib, and I apologise for that. It may even be controversial. I think there's a fundamental distinction between the libertarian and the communal ends of the spectrum, in that the libertarians primarily are interested in wealth and money and the tangible, and those who are interested in the common good are more interested in intangibles and caring for others, and have basic concepts about what are the minimum standards that should be available to their fellow human beings. Now, I think that difference of approach is absolutely fundamental. Now, we would have to say that at the moment, with the government that we have, the venal and the uncaring and the unprincipled are absolutely in the ascendancy. And I try to specify that irrespective of your political party, that is objectively my observation. And our task perhaps is to just encourage a more caring view overall.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Henry, we're just 5 minutes over our normal time, but I'd like to maybe wrap up within the next 10 minutes or so. I don't know if you wanted to come back on anything that's just been said.
If I come back, if you like, on what Paul has just, one point that Paul has raised. Again, I can't speak for Nozick at all, but I think his likely response to, the rich, they're pretty stingy with a few, if you like, headline exceptions, and that's headline in the philanthropic sense of the word. Nozick would just turn around and say, that's absolutely right. They are stingy, so let's incentivize them. Let's incentivize them instead of beating them up, and possibly beating them up so hard that they leave the country, and that whole realm of offshore financing to avoid paying tax.
Okay, well, Henry, we don't have any more hands up at the moment. Do you want to sort of say anything by way of a conclusion, or do you want to leave things hanging in the air, or?
If I can leave things hanging in the air, I think that's really what I want to achieve. As I mentioned very early on, if I've whetted your appetite in any of the issues, then I feel as though I've achieved my own personal aim this afternoon. So, yeah.
Well, you've certainly whetted mine. I mean, I'd like to. I've got a copy of John Rawls's book on my bookshelf, waiting to be read. But maybe I need to have a look at Nozick as well at some point, as it's quite a seminal book. Belinda has just put a comment in the chat. What kind of incentive would that be? I think maybe you might want to just briefly comment on how can we incentivize the rich to be less stingy. I'm thinking of maybe some kind of public. When you go to theatres and things in the States, you find that their names are, the benefactors are emblazoned in large letters in these places, and that even happens in places like Lighthouse as well. That might be one answer to that. I don't know if you've got any other quick ideas, Henry, on that question.
Broadly speaking, it's carrots and sticks. And sticks tend not to be a very efficient or effective incentive scheme. The carrots do. And so I suppose the big carrot here, it's the biggest carrot in terms of funding, will be hypothecated taxes. And the main obstacle to hypothecated taxes are politicians, because it takes the hands off the budget and puts it into the hands of the people who vote. And I think that's called democracy.
Is that noise coming from you, Henry?
It is, and there's an incoming call, and unless I mute myself, I can't.
That's all right. Don't worry.
I'm going to let the call go. I'm letting the call go.
Okay. Henry, thank you so much for all the work you've put into this afternoon. I think you're right that it's such a glib phrase, isn't it? The common good, and we all sort of think we know what we mean by it. But when you start breaking it down, it really makes you think that there's a lot more to it in terms of needing to unpack it. So you've started us on that process today. I think it's been very stimulating, and as you say, I think it's raised lots of questions, and I hope people will go away and do a little bit more thinking and reading on the topic. So thank you once again. I'm just going to say a few things before we wrap up. Our next event on Zoom is on Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock, and that's our Zoom coffee morning. We have some amazing conversations once a fortnight on a Tuesday, so do please join us if you'd like to. I will get that up on Meetup in the next day or so. Our next scheduled meeting at the Elstead Hotel is on Wednesday, the 26th of January at 7:30, but we'll have to see whether we can go ahead with a live event. In any case, we're hoping that Mike Flood, who is chair of Milton Keynes Humanists, will be talking to us about fake news and misinformation. In a month's time, we're hoping to have a Darwin Day at Moordown Community Centre, but you do need to get a ticket for that, for this event. Lynn, I don't know if you want to say a few more words about Darwin Day, if you're still with us, Lynn.
Yes, I am. Certainly, we just need to know the numbers. It is free to members, but a small charge to, I can't remember how much we're saying now, for those who are not members. And but obviously we'll be providing the catering, and I think we're thinking it will start about 1 o'clock. And but you should have my email on the newsletters and things like this to let me know if you are planning to come. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lynn. So that will be Arian Shireen talking to us about her book, How to Live to 100. We always say that if you're a member of Dorset Humanists, that's almost guaranteed anyway, but she may have some additional handy hints in her book. We're hoping that that will go ahead, but obviously we'll have to see what's happening in terms of public health announcements before then. On Sunday, the 23rd of January, some of us will be taking part in Holocaust Memorial Day. It was going to be at the Lighthouse, but now that's going to be on Zoom as well. Our treasurer, Daniel Dancy, will be doing a short reading, and Maggie Pepin will also be doing the pledge at the end of the event. So do please join us online if you would like to, and just go to the Bournemouth and Poole Holocaust Memorial Day website. I've got a couple of school visits coming up in the next couple of weeks, Twynham School and Highcliffe Comprehensive. So I'll be talking to the students there about humanism. And our events are always free. We always do appreciate any money that you can give. It's rather difficult today on Zoom, but please don't forget that our winter appeal is still open. Our winter appeal, very topically, is giving to Hope for Food, which is a local food bank. So do please donate to that, but you can donate via our own account. If you would like to know our bank details, then do get in touch with me and I can get that information to you. that's it from us, and that's it from Dorset Humanists. Thanks once again, Henri. And if you would like to show your appreciation for Henri, you can do so either by a silent clap or you can do reactions on the screen. But thank you all very much for turning up, and we hope to see you all again very soon. Thanks, Henri.